we have Facebook rolling, we have Twitch rolling, we have another YouTube camera, and we have Instagram rolling.
You are the best techie guy ever.
This is borderline ridiculous.
It's tremendous.
4 different cameras. We went from 1 to 4.
Well, if you're going to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
You ready?
I'm ready. Do it. Yeah.
Okay, there's a little intro here, so
Get that intro.
It's only in our head.
I do like that song. That song sounds great. Welcome back to Fitness or Fiction, a podcast dedicated to cutting through the hype of the health and fitness industry.
Every week, we dig into a new topic and help you wade through the real information to make solid decisions on your fitness journey. And boom, we're officially live in 3 different places. And you might be watching this on YouTube or a podcast while you're driving your car. Curtis?
Welcome. That's quite the thing. That sounds really fun. Hopefully it's as fun as it sounds.
I don't know. We'll see. It kind of sucks. If you're on our Instagram chat on mine, I can't talk to you because I cannot see the chat room, but I will embrace you telepathically.
From afar.
And Curtis may or may not be talking to his Facebook Live.
Yeah, I don't know if I can do that from my computer while we're live. We'll find out. But all right, so today we are talking about controlled articular rotations.
Cars,
yeah.
not the automobiles you drive.
No. Controlled articular rotations meaning active circles. So this is one of those things that gets a little bit frustrating for me because it's a mainstay in the FRC certification. I really enjoy what it actually presents. I've been using it for myself and my clients for some time, but the challenge is, you have people be like, oh yeah, I do circles. I'm good. That's not new.
Well, FRC stands for Functional Range Conditioning, which was a course that you took, which is really valuable.
So Andrea Spina is very good. If you haven't taken that course, I highly recommend it. But the whole idea with functional range conditioning is we are trying to own the ranges that we have first and foremost, and it's also a system for expanding ranges that you might need.
Yeah.
So it ends up, it's a very valuable course. There's a lot of really good stuff that's presented on it, but
so I think I just wanted to say before we get into this information, everything that we've been talking about a couple episodes of a lot of mobility based stuff, like how to increase flexibility, reduce pain, DOMs, all this kind of jazz. You were just saying offline though, like everything we've studied for flexibility thus far has had like a lot of like multiple studies done, like blind studies and things like this to analyze whether it's actually accurate or not. You were saying that cars is relatively new, so it's harder to get that information?
It's harder to have the stuff kind of bite in because it is newer. Even circumduction, like people waving their arm in a circle before they pitch, is not new.
Yeah.
But I couldn't really find much on it, which is, it's interesting. And you can do, I think that comes back to like active and passive, which is totally fine. But with cars, I've seen anecdotal proof myself. Andrea Spina presented a lot of really very good research and findings that they've had. But as far as accessing it myself, I was having a really hard go here. So I'm going to speak a little bit on anecdote, a little bit on the certificate, and hopefully get people a better idea of why this is a good thing to do.
Let's get it.
So when we start talking about mobility, what we've discovered so far, we've done passive stretching, we've done PNF, we've done foam rolling, which people call myofascial release, usually a misnomer.
Yeah.
Now it's really, and with massage guns too, which is kind of similar.
No, the hardest thing for me with all of these episodes we've filmed and recorded is how much debunking it's done and how much people believe in a lot of this stuff, whereas like the studies kind of, they say it's have its place, but it's not like the magic pill that everyone desires. And it's hard when I'm like cruising the internet or if I'm talking to people and they just believe that there's these truths, like static stretching is a truth to like after you exercise it helps recovery or helps gain range of motion, and it's just not as valuable as I once thought.
I like to call mobility a shady place. It's a shady place because people hide there. It's like, well, I'm a mobility expert. It's like, okay, well, what makes you a mobility expert? Well, I'm super flexible. Oh, okay, so why did you develop your systems that way? And I'm not saying that nobody has a good idea on it, but I am saying the best system I've found mobility specific is FRC, and Spina will talk often about how range for the sake of it is garbage.
Yeah.
So after this series, we're going to get into, we haven't fully decided yet, but looks like we're going to go in the direction of talking about what exercise does to your brain.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that's super important to understand is that exercise is about training the brain.
Yeah.
And people are thinking, well, I'm training my biceps. It's like, well, those are only changing if your brain deems it so.
Your brain is the one talking and doing all the
either
actual work.
Neurologically, mechanically, or biochemically, it's making a change.
Yeah.
So what are we really training? We are training the brain. Even to have that contraction, the brain has to say, please contract that against a force.
Yeah. And how well you can actually send that signal is also...
Yeah, and that's why we see beginners have such huge changes in strength. It's actually not the muscle tissue changing that much. It's mainly neurological.
Mm-hmm.
The brain's learning how to use those tissues better and making them more efficient. So when we talk about what we've found so far, it's kind of frustrating because a lot of it is like, oh, you can increase range of motion. And my big thing is, well, do you want to? Have we identified a reason that makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing is we need to identify garbage range of motion. So let's say somebody has a hamstring that they can stretch all the way up to their shoulder without moving their back. And then you ask them to lift it, and they can only go like 3/4.
Yeah, so they have an extreme passive, but not a very well active range.
Yeah, so the larger the discrepancy, the bigger the issue. So what mobility training becomes very quickly is, what can you actually do with that structure? Not passively, not I can stretch into the hamstring like this. What can you actually do with that joint? What's it comfortable doing itself?
Mm-hmm.
And what needs to be in place for that is a variety of things, but one of the big things that needs to be in place is a neurological motor unit. So once you have a motor unit, then you can have control of that. And then we want to build strength in that, because typically when we're going for mobility, what we're trying to do is get that system ready for that, meaning avoid injury usually. People talk about that too much, but definition of injury, putting force through a tissue that it can't bear so it yields.
Yeah.
So when we start getting into controlled articular rotations, this ends up being one of the better preparatory things that we run into. And there's a few reasons behind it. Really, the development of motor units, when we look at, say, a chest press, whether it's a Techno Gym or a Nautilus or whatever machine it is, usually you'll see the little person and their whole pec is highlighted.
Yeah.
That's not really the way that the brain works.
Mm-hmm.
It's, let's say we're doing across this way. It's mainly sternal fibers, so it's going to be the ones that attach here on the inside, not the clavicular or costal, not high or low, but across the middle. And if we're in that angle and we're coming across, it's like, okay, well, is that whole muscle active? No. It's going to be a particular unit that's active. And it changes per rep, actually.
Yeah.
So...
Well, every rep is going to have different communication from the brain every single time too, right?
Yeah, and that's to avoid breakdown.
Yeah.
So it cycles through these different motor programs, a coordination of muscle activity. But I think the first place to start with is, well, if we're going to do cars, what is it? And this can happen around any joint. Our joints are meant for a lot of different things, and it varies per joint. But especially at our ball and socket joints, the requirement is rotation, because everything in a ball and socket is rotation.
Hips and shoulders.
Yeah. Well, and to a lesser degree, the medial aspect of the knee. But let's say we're going after the wrist. A controlled articular rotation would be all the way in the largest possible circle that you can make.
Yeah.
Without compensating with anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what we're teaching there, we are preparing the articular surfaces. So preparing articular surfaces is important, and I think we should actually do an episode at some point on cartilage and arthritis, because that's something that people think that is like a permanence.
Mm-hmm.
And a permanence, that sucks. Like when you're like, oh, I have arthritis, so I'm just done. I can't change it.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you might not be able to change that, but you can change your function and your sensation.
Mm-hmm.
These are still adaptive tissues, yeah?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's the first thing with controlled articular rotations.
So the controlled articular rotation is just trying to form like just the biggest circle possible that you have control of in that joint, which means not like dynamically like flipping it around. Like,
that's right.
It's very smooth and controlled. You would never do a car fast per se?
Well, I think that you can. I've seen a lot of baseball pitchers do more of a relaxed sort of controlled articular rotation where it's a little bit more passive. So it's like arm swings. That I would say that's different. I haven't really seen a execution of that. This is more active control, and you're going to work all the way up until you can load it.
Yeah.
So, but in order to improve our neurological control, what we want is to get as much feedback as possible. So if we're getting feedback, it begs the question, where does feedback come from? From a brain level. And you get a lot of proprioception, that's like the sensation of touch. But the joint provides the most, and it's more 3D than a muscle, because a muscle really just kind of has contract, relax, and as you contract, it'll present force in a variety of directions. But as far as awareness of force, it's mainly in the directions the muscle goes.
Yeah.
So the joint has a direct feedback loop to the brain, and is likely going to be the place that provides the most feedback the fastest. So that's the first thing in controlled articular rotations. The other thing is the capsule has a lot more mechanoreceptors, like a lot of numbers of things going to the brain. And this is the stuff you can actually find research on. Like this information is not stuff that's like, well, I'm not sure about that. This is stuff. The actual application is the part that's kind of hard to find. So a joint is essentially the first thing to perceive emotion. Yeah. Which is, I think that's valuable to know. Because if, like, when people have a tight muscle, what do they say and what do they think is happening? Tell me a story, Eric. Story time.
If people have a tight muscle, what do they think's happening?
My hamstrings are tight. Tell me the story you hear.
I don't know what you're looking for here.
Eric, my hamstrings are tight. I think it's because I work too hard or because
I sit down all day. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do they do?
They statically stretch.
Right. And are they considering what they're doing there? They're thinking of it like
They're thinking like the mechanical tissues, they're actually getting longer.
Right.
I think that's what most people think.
Right.
Let me just speak for everybody. I'm good at that.
That's not the first time you've done that, and I still like it.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people, when they think about stretching the tissue, they think that they're actually gaining physical length in that tissue rather than the brain just like easing off on the tightness sensation.
Right. And what we actually are trying to do is train the actual articular surfaces and get more motor unit feedback going to our brain, because if we have more feedback, we can make more adjustments. So I like to say that the joint is kind of the mommy and daddy, the muscles are the kids.
Okay.
So like you go and you massage the muscle, you beat up the muscle. It's like, well, that muscle is likely facilitated tight by your brain because there's something not happening at the joint. Like the person that says, I can't squat all the way down without weight, there's 3 types of motion: active, passive, and then loaded. Yeah. And loaded has things that'll make it easier and things that'll make it harder. Yeah. So if you can't squat all the way down without weight, there's something your hips don't want to do on their own. That's something I'd probably look into.
Yeah, that's a scary one.
Yeah. Well, but we see a lot of it, right? So controlled articular rotations is our first conversation on active ranges. Yeah. So active range, I guess PNF was a little bit too, but a controlled articular rotation, or CAR, is going to give us rotational feedback through the joint, and it's going to show us where our borders are. And one thing that I assess when I see somebody doing this is you find those areas that are just missing, or that there's skips through. Yeah, yeah. You're trying to move the wrist, and then it's like,
That's my ankles.
Yeah.
If I try to do CARs with my ankles, like if you just elevate the foot off the bed and try to do like the biggest circle, it's hard though. I find like trying to explain this just via audio. It's not just like drawing a circle with your big toe, because that's different. Like there's inversion and eversion at play as well, and I think that's where a lot of people would drop the ball in a location like the ankle.
That's right, yeah.
But yeah, my ankles skip like a mofo.
That's most people. Don't train our feet very much, and they do a lot for us. Yeah. So in my joint level strength class, we really get after that sometimes, and people are like, "Ow, my arches."
Yeah, I think a lot of people cramp a lot when they're doing things like this. Lots of crampy.
Yeah. Well, in exploring the outer range of your articulation or your joint means that we're establishing what is the limitation. Yeah. And I talk to people a lot about, well, if the definition of injury is you put force through something and it can't handle it, so it yields, then what happens when you provide better feedback and better strength in that range, well, it's harder to hurt you. So last week I caught a clean and my leg went forward and it jammed my elbow down on my leg with 205 pounds on this hand in extension.
Yeah.
And today I can still feel that it happened, but I have full range of this wrist.
Yeah.
So it didn't cause an injury, which I was super happy with because I was worried about it. But I seriously think the only reason that it didn't is because I'm actually relatively strong there because I train it.
Yeah.
Which, it doesn't sound so crazy, but when we look at doing this stuff, it's not going to make you super jacked, so we shouldn't spend that much time on it if that's your goal. But at the same time, you know what stops you from getting really jacked?
Having poor movement quality.
Or injuries.
Yeah.
Yeah. So by doing those outer ranges, we can ensure that we have all of our mechanoreceptors activated. We're improving control, essentially. We can improve strength there depending on how we choose to load it. And one of the big things to get across is, yes, we are training the neurological system, but there's a lot of other systems involved as well that are still adaptive. So your joint capsule, your tendons, your ligaments, and your cartilage, those aren't preset. They are tissues that turn over, and you can train them. Should we do it safe? Yeah, we should. But progressive tissue adaptation is kind of the name of the game. So other than that, one of the big things that we want to do, creating control, before you can do that, we're creating awareness. So if somebody doesn't know their ankle's doing that, how do you get that back? Calf raises probably won't do it.
Yeah. No.
And
Are you talking about the skips when somebody's doing like a circle
for
on
sure,
the ankle?
Yeah.
Like how do you improve that?
Yeah.
Are you asking me? Are you
I
about to
am.
tell me the answer?
I'm asking you.
I'm assuming you need to do it more.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, if
Common sense. Bling.
yeah, well, sometimes it's like, well, how do I get a better squat? It's like, have you practiced the squat? Like,
Yeah.
that's probably a good place to start, right?
Without load.
Yeah. So it's like, well, I need more eversion on my ankle. It's like, well, have you actually practiced getting there? Like, can you do that?
Yeah.
Well, and most people are like, with traditional exercise, we get stuck in this thing where it's like, do 10 reps of eversion.
Yeah.
It's like, well, most of what we do is kind of rotational anyways. If we look at gait, like walking gait.
Most of our exercises in general, when people plug away at functional fitness, though, like that term thrown around really, really funny. And our body, like it doesn't move like that. You know what I mean? Like even doing like a seated row, being super rigid and pulling 150 pounds. Like I'm never going to pull anything heavy that rigid. Like if a truck's stuck in the mud or in the winter, Alberta winter here, I'm not going to like grab it and like load myself perfectly and just use my arms. Ugh.
Does exponential tension or stiffness, let's say stiffness, exponential stiffness, does that equal stability is my question.
Exponential stiffness equals stability?
Yeah, as you get more and more stiffness to your core, does that equate to stability necessarily?
Not necessarily, no.
No. That's a really important thing to understand. So when we talk about adaptive tissues, we have to come back to fascia, and there's different layers of fascia. There's like superficialis, fascia profunda. You've got it all the way down to like between muscles. Your muscles are in sheaths of fascia. It's connective tissue, but it acts as an organ, and it connects different muscles to each other. And there's this speech from a while ago. I forgot the name of the guy who did it, but if you look up White Fuzz on YouTube, he does this big speech on how your body is kind of working on relatively new tissue or immature fibrosis, like new fascia, versus stuff that's been around for a while that they call mature. And when it's relatively new, it's easy to adjust and change because it hasn't really thickened up or anything. And that's part of the reason why it's really important to explore the ranges that you have. So controlled articular rotations at things like the hip and shoulder, I would see as a must. And when I watch my client Damien, he's a former gymnast, when he does his warm-up for Olympic lifting, he uses the 45-pound bar to do full circumductions down to his butt and back up because he's strong enough in every range.
Yeah.
Pretty hard to hurt his shoulder.
Yeah, his shoulders are like football pads times 2.
Bomb diggity.
Yeah.
That's what they are. They're bomb diggity. That's
like
the
your
technical
shoulders,
term.
Damien.
I hope you're listening today, Damien. But really, when we talk control articular rotations, we're talking like active rotational movements. And usually you would start in something that's like not that hard. So like a supine shoulder car, just laying on your back, lifting your arm down to the floor and then back up. And we can stand up. We can go chest supported to change the way that the load of the arm challenges you. Then we can start adding like cables and weights, and we can start challenging that. But one of the cool things is that we can challenge every single angle, whereas we'd have to get a lot of different exercises together if we wanted to challenge each one of those angles on their own. But don't get it twisted. This isn't something that should take up your whole workout.
Yeah, I feel so. I've bumped into some guys who are FRC, like FRS boys, FRC boys, and if they almost get like tied into it, like it's the full story, I feel, and like it's just the pure focus. Like doing these cars, like how often do you execute these cars? Let's say you weren't even teaching your joint level class. Like if you weren't teaching your joint level class and you were just following a regular program yourself, how often would you hit these cars?
Damn near daily.
You think daily?
Yeah, and I'm not going to do a ton of reps, but like if you do a really controlled articular rotation at your shoulder, controlled, yeah. If you do a really controlled car, you'll actually notice change in like 2 or 3 reps. And you don't need to train it forever, but like you can do some bench. Should you check on your shoulders that day? Yeah. We have a lot of challenges when we start losing control of zones.
Yeah.
And so that's something that I'm like, yeah, you know what? I actually do these every day. I've talked about a lot of stuff I don't do for warm-up.
Mm-hmm.
These are something that I often use. If I'm doing a chest or back day, I'll do some shoulder cars. If I'm doing a leg day of any sort, I usually do hip cars. And I've noticed big improvements.
It's like a 5-minute type thing?
Yeah, if that.
It's funny because I'm obviously misinformed, and I've never studied this material before. But like my assumption of this material prior to me and you talking and prior to me learning right now was I was under the assumption that you had to do like 5 minutes on the same piece, like nonstop. Like if I was doing my ankle, let's say, it was like set a timer for 5 minutes and away you go for 5 minutes and then go the other way for 5 minutes. I thought it was something ridiculous, like you had to do like 100 reps or 100 rotations to actually like reap benefits from.
Well, this is, like I said, one of the most valuable courses I've taken. It's Andrea Spina, Functional Range Systems. Functional Range Conditioning is the exact course I'm talking about. And I love that in the course he talks about this is not getting you bendy for the sake of it. I create beasts is what he says, and he does. But the amount that you're going to need, like the jamming of the wrist, I probably did like 2,000 cars over the case of the first 48 hours after I jammed my wrist up. And it really does get things moving again. So, if you're dealing with something that's acute, could you do more? For sure. But usually with my clients, I'm not programming them these long extended periods, especially once they have control there. And you'll hear Kaz Hansen talk about like, well, if you're training tissues right and setting up right, you're not going to need all of these like hip bands and lengthy warm-ups. Like go and warm up the drill you're going to use because you should be able to find control and work there.
Yeah.
You should have a diminishing trajectory on your warm-ups.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny just where the fitness industry has gone, because some people, like when they get ready for their warm-up back, like a couple years ago, was like foam roller, bands, lacrosse balls, and like doing like this whole big production of like 20 to 25 minutes worth of warm-up. That's actually something I'd like to podcast on as well, is like, how much really warm-up do you need?
Yeah, well, when we looked at it with foam rolling, it was like, oh, there's no difference between 30 seconds and 90 seconds.
Well, and there was huge diminishing returns. Like,
huge.
Yeah, it's going to open you up for about 5 minutes, and then you got to redo it and then keep going. And it's like, oh, so I have to foam roll in between every set in order to keep this range that it unlocked.
And this is kind of where I'm going with this, is that active is better than passive as a generalized rule. Obviously, if you're getting out of surgery, you probably start with some isometric squeezes or something. You're not going to be doing cars with your joint right away.
Yeah.
But typically when we're looking at warm-ups and stuff, if you're doing something active, we're teaching the brain something. If we're doing something passive, we're trying to get facilitated relaxation.
Yeah, or just what was it? The sensation of tightness, just being more resilient to it. Right?
Yeah. So I think that this is a really good kind of segue before we get into our full active ranges conversation with liftoffs and strengthening, because I went and took the N1 course with Kaz Hansen, and it was really good. I took the FRC course with Andrea Spina. These are two of the best courses I've ever taken, and they don't realize how much they agree.
Which I think is saying a lot, because I think you're a pretty smart cat, and you've taken a lot of courses. So if you're like praising these specific ones, that means something.
I have taken at least a course a year since 2006.
Yeah.
And previous to that was my degree. So, but at least a course a year, meaning some years more. And those are, I would say, the two best ones. So if there's anybody asking questions on what course is the best, I can tell you, in my opinion, those are the two best ones I've ever taken.
Yeah.
So, but to wrap everything up, controlled articular rotations, they're about figuring out how to control your joint through end ranges, which is super important. This is going to provide lots of feedback for your mechanoreceptors. It's also going to develop more motor units so that you can control more ranges and better control them.
Mm-hmm.
When you take somebody who's new, you'll see that they have this kind of small range and it's skippy. Then you start seeing it really improve, and you'll notice changes in their general quality of movement, especially in those areas.
Yeah.
So it opens up opportunity, which is actually really exciting. And the other thing that, we can discuss more is that tissue adaptation isn't just muscles. Tissue adaptation is muscles, tendons, ligaments, capsular, even cartilage based in that capsule. So knowing that, when we're trying to warm up, we should be looking at the whole system. It's not just about the muscles. We should be thinking more about the joint, and that requires movement or articulation.
Yeah. So I'm not, again, informed on cars too much, but to my understanding, I've done them once or twice, and I've been shown them once or twice. I was essentially prescribed full body cars pre and maybe post workout. And I was trying to do 5 or 10 rotations each direction. So I thought it was a lot. I was like, damn, this is a whole production just to get warm and to cool down. But the cars I was doing was neck, shoulder, elbow, wrist, thoracic spine, like that.
Yeah, I do. That's
Sexy.
a good dance move too.
Sexy. Yeah. And then hips, knees, ankles. Did I miss something?
Yeah. Well, you can do them all the way down to the level of the finger, right? Seriously.
Don't go this way.
You can,
1, 2, 3, 4.
Here's my thing though. Can you do a full body warm up? Yes, but how much into the minutia do we need to go? Oh, that's a good one.
Oh man.
Oh, it's a little skippy over there.
Single fingered cars are difficult.
Yeah. Oh no.
I want to be really good at that. That actually even feels greasy though. Just rocking my finger back and forth. I feel things like tissue, skipping beats
nailed
and stuff.
that movement? Babu Bhatt on Seinfeld. You're a very bad man.
I never watched Seinfeld.
Yeah, so good. But
okay.
Yeah, can you do it really into the minutia? Yeah, you can. And if you have a hand issue, that all of a sudden makes sense.
It does make sense.
But
now
if
that you say it.
don't, how much do we need to get into it? I get some tension in my elbow. I have some golf or tennis elbow. You should probably do some elbow cars then.
Yeah.
Probably up the chain to the shoulder, down the chain to the wrist. But if we continue to go up the chain, we run the risk of overwhelming them. And this is just a program design thing. You overwhelm somebody, they experience fear, which means F everything and run. Means they do nothing.
Yeah.
So I would say start small with it. And when people see the value and notice the differences, then you can get more.
Yeah.
So
I think as we're speaking about cars, I think it's something that you can't just tackle by yourself anyways. If you know nothing about it, and even I don't know that much about them, I can maybe fake my way through it a little bit, but it's not just doing circles with the joints, because when you're trying to do a hip car, for instance, that's more complex than just kind of trying to move that in a circle, right? Because when you start doing internal, external rotation, with hip flexion, hip extension, it starts to change the game. You almost have to do a side lying, and there's lots of ways that position, that hip moves as you're lying down. So,
well, differentiation of the hip and the lumbar is a super key component of movement. Because people that can't lift their knee without flexing their spine often have spinal problems. So exactly what you're talking about is a challenge, but also the success of it. So if you lay on your back and start doing circles with your leg and you're doing it straight and you don't know the right way, that's still better than just doing I'm going to stretch my hamstring today.
Yeah.
So could you have somebody take you through this and make it more valuable? Yeah. I'm still working through this to figure out more value to it. So I'm looking at going and taking my functional range assessment course next, which is through functional range systems as well. But this is something that I think more people need to know about and train, because I have run into multiple people in the last, since May 1, that have said, well, I've had this issue for this long and whatever else, and I'm running the FRC playbook with them, and it works really well. And one of the people that talk about it the most is Kyle Winstanley. He'll be like, listen, I haven't had a significant injury the entirety of my powerlifting career, and all of these strategies are really the thing. And the big deal is I'm not telling him it's me. It's I'm wielding the best I can the education that I took through them.
Yeah. So for Gen Pop, it wouldn't like executing cars like pre-workout, so just like rotations of the joint. Controlled and smooth, though, is probably a more effective workout than just statically stretching and things like that. How smooth or slow would you want one circle in one direction? So if I'm going to do like one circle this direction, one circle the other direction, are you talking like a 10-second circle? Or like, because like, so I want to stress that it should be smooth and controlled, not like flailing.
Usually we talk about it in terms of irradiation. So it's like, how hard am I squeezing? If I squeeze my bicep 100%, it doesn't go anywhere.
They pop,
but if
though.
I squeeze it 9 out of 10, I can move it smooth and slow, right? So usually we're going to start training somebody with relatively low levels. And we don't want to grind through painful areas. We just move through what the joint's happy to do.
Yeah.
And over time, that's going to open. We're not working through pain, and we don't want to squeeze through pain. So usually what I'll do with people is start with like a 5 out of 10. Like move through it really slow. Give me 5 seconds each direction. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We're going to go slow enough that they can have control. So like 5 to 10 seconds per direction, and we can start out with like 5 out of 10 irradiation and start improving that as we go.
Yeah.
But if somebody's moving and trying to get a consistent pace and finding the actual control, like a good example is I give people side lying shoulder raises. So they're just lying on their side. They lift their arm as far back as they can, and then they bring it back. People that are new, what they'll usually do is just flap their arm through that, and they're like, I don't feel anything. I'm like, okay, I want you to make your arm as long as you can and really squeeze and find what tissues will do that for you.
Yeah.
And it can really change the game for someone's movement, just connecting them to like what's actually moving that. I'm not just going to flap there. I'm going to learn how to squeeze, figure out what muscles do that. And it's not all about sensation, but you should be able to control the range, right?
Yeah, make it smooth, feel it.
Yeah. So anyways, if you're still here, controlled articular rotations are something that are super valuable for warm-up. I would argue that for everything that we've been through so far, this is the best place to start. I would much rather see somebody do this over just stretching their hamstrings, because it offers so much more feedback and so much more motor learning for the system.
And that's the hard thing for people to wrap their head around, though. I think if somebody's complaining that they have tight hamstrings, they want to feel some sensation in the hamstring, whereas if they're just doing a hip rotation, they're not going to necessarily feel that hamstring that much, maybe unless they're doing a straight leg version. But still, like, it's not going to translate directly to their brain. Like, a lot of people are like, I feel pain here, so the problem must be here. Like, I had a client who came in and he was hanging on my chin-up bar in a supinated grip. And he's like, oh man, my wrist is killing me. And I'm like, I don't think it's from your wrist. I think it's from your shoulders, because his arm position was out of whack. And then when we did like a supinated like lat pullover, the range was like completely cockeyed.
So assuming that a problem is from where your sensation is one of the biggest challenges that I deal with my clients. I have pain at the front of my shoulder. That's almost always brought to you by the posterior capsule not allowing you to do what you should. Mm-hmm. So it pinches on a closing angle anteriorly. So as I close the joint, anterior. But that's not the problem. The problem is brought to you by the back of the shoulder. So that's why I say, again, it's not all about mashing the tissue and stretching the tissue. What if we learned how to move that joint better, and we just work through to control and work with our body instead of fighting it? Mm-hmm. Because we should be working with our body and learning how to use it rather than fighting and grinding through, and I need to feel more pain, more sensation. It doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting.
Yeah. Do you have any other final remarks or questions, conversation, feedback?
Let me think with my brain for a second.
That's better than thinking with other things.
My biceps. Yeah, no, I think, like you said, it's a relatively new, like from your experience and from my experience as well, from the outside looking in, I've seen like a lot of good things with this system, but it's not just like there hasn't been multiple university-based studies to like really seal the deal and say this is the answer. I'm wondering what, like one day, I wonder if the future is near where like humans are actually going to be able to identify like the most optimal exercise program, because it feels like, like I've said this before, like nobody's doing the same thing per se, but like to be like, oh, your goal is this or this is the 100% the most optimal program, 100% for whatever your goals are. And then like we're almost out of a job if it ever gets to that point. But like I wonder if that point is in 50 years from now or 100 years from now.
I think that point is going to be directly specific to the person. Like that's the biggest thing that they talk about with N1 that gets me really excited is they're like, well, let's talk about what this person needs, where they've been, and what their setup looks like for their physiology. It goes a long way to look at a person as a number of one is how they talk about it in N1.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of a lot of things. You see a lot of like, become a $10,000 trainer online. And I'm like, oh man, but maybe that's a great program. I'm not poo-pooing on anyone, but when I see that, I'm like, I wonder, like, okay, so see our system. It's like, well, what if instead of trying to fit a person into your system, you looked at the person as an individual and created the system for them? I think that's where it's going. And I think that's the case when you look at illness too. I think what we're going to do is get better at being like, here's all of your levels. And for you need to eat less of and more of. So it's not a magic pill. Yeah. It's a magic prescription.
Yeah.
And the closer to that, I think the higher the truth is going to be in the solution. So.
Cool.
And on that note, thank you for being with us today in our maiden voyage of projecting through to a variety of platforms.
Cars.
Yeah.
My neck cracked like 15 times. Crack.
I wouldn't say that was the most controlled rotation.
Felt controlled.
All right.
Cool.
Well, thanks everybody. Take care. Have a good day. And we'll talk to you soon, hopefully.
Bleep bloop.
Bleep bloop.
Thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate your support.
If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you would subscribe, follow, and throw us a like on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts.